Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me.
Okay. Hi, Polly. Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Thank you, Josh. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, you as well. I just like we were talking about before we started recording, I'm always in search of people who can have interesting conversations. And for me, a lot of the things that I'm interested in are myths and stories and symbols. And so I often reach out to people who are in the Jungian camp or who, psychoanalysts or just people who are investigating that model of psychology. And for me personally, I found that once I came upon it, and I've just done a lot of reading myself. I have a big stack of Jungian books. I just find that model of viewing the human psyche, both as individual psyches and also as collective psyches, it just really helps me see what's happening in the world. Like I can actually kind of perceive the interactions that are going on. But I also, I like to reach out to people who are doing something unique in that space. And for you, it seems like you do a lot of things. You do a podcast, you do a new Substack, but you also have this nonprofit organization that you founded. And a lot of it is geared towards dialogue and what you call real dialogue. And so I want to get into that. I want to get into what is dialogue, and I want to learn about your organization. But before we do that, I just want to get to know you a little bit. And I'm curious about your story. And really, the thing I like to ask people is, when did you become interested in this analysis of reality, this analysis of psychology? When did you feel yourself gravitating towards symbols or stories? And how young were you when that started to happen?
Well, I was 12 years old. And then after that, 16 years old. So when I was 12 years old, I recognized that, the way I recognized it was that I said to myself that I hated my father. Now, I also was, I grew up in a working class family. My parents met working in a factory. Neither of them had gone to high school. So I was a very odd child in the situation that I was in. And the degree of intelligence that I had was burdensome for everyone, including me, my parents, my cousins. I was an only child of my parents, and they had me after my father came back from the war. So they were older parents. I was odd, socially odd because of my intelligence. And then even the school that I went to, my mother didn't drive. We lived in the country. I went to a school that was 4 miles away. And when they gave me an IQ test, they wanted to transfer me out of the school. So I had all of these kinds of oddities that were, in a way, sort of troubling. I didn't know I was that odd at the time. And but it put me, I think, in touch with my own mind. I started remembering my dreams and noting them quite early. I remember a few of my first dreams, but I didn't know what they meant. And I was Roman Catholic, and I took that very seriously. That was really the only sort of culture I was exposed to. But at some point, I began to recognize that my father was very disturbed. As it turned out, his father had been murdered and his mother committed suicide by the time he was 10 years old. Now, he never talked about that, so I only learned that as an adult from my uncle. But I got interested really in his mind because he didn't talk a lot during the day, but at night he would go into rants. And I think that the kind of rants he went into were peculiar for me because they were about me and my mother, but they were made up. Like, they weren't really about what we were doing. So by the time I was 16, I was volunteering at the state mental hospital in my spare time. I mean, for me, that was what was fun. And I was meeting with people who were coming out of ECT. And so the hospital allowed me, because by that time, I mean, I was extremely responsible. I was a very good student. And the state hospital allowed me, 15 and 16 years old, to interview people that had just come out of electric shock therapy because they were coming back to trying to remember their identities. And so I think they just thought I was a nice kid. And I would sit there with these people who, many of whom were suffering from some sort of psychotic disturbance. And I would listen to their stories, and their stories really were myths. Now, I didn't even know exactly what a myth was, but I could tell that there were big figures in the story. Like it would be Jesus who is fighting with the devil, or it would be some kind of robot that was fighting with another robot. And I could tell that these were dreamlike figures. And that was one thing that stood out for me. But I also could see, and this was more interesting, that the people took this very seriously. That this wasn't a trip. This was not like, just what you're thinking about, like something that grabs your mind. It was like a world that these people were in. And the people took this world seriously. And I could see that it was a state of mind. I didn't have words like that, but I could see that they were in a different state of mind. And then I realized my father also would be in this other state of mind. So in some ways, I had something like Jung's insight, Carl Jung's insight that his mother had a number 1 and number 2 personality. I could see my father had a different personality during the day, where he never spoke about what he would do at night. And then at night, he would go into some other thing that wasn't like the way he was during the day. And to some extent, that fascinated me. I mean, it also scared me, of course, but honestly, I was so isolated from anyone who understood any of this that it was all going on privately for me. And by the time I went to college then, I was going to study psychology because I thought that was the field in which you could study the human mind. And it turned out not to be, because it was behaviorism and rats. And I was in the psychology major for a while. I was in honors psychology. I published an article in a journal. And then I thought, this is really bullshit, frankly, because if they're going to publish this article that I wrote, and I'm, a sophomore in college, there must be something wrong with this field. And they seem to talk about trivial things. So I switched around different majors. Eventually, I ended up in English literature and then in medieval studies. And so again, the reason I was attracted to medieval studies is that there was a different worldview. The world was animated and it was connected. There wasn't this break between the subject and the object being de-animated and the subject being animated. And again, I didn't have the words for that in college either. Neither did anybody else around me, really, because I wasn't studying philosophy. But anyway, I went into medieval English literature, and I probably would have stayed there, except by some sort of trick of fate, I got into the Black Power movement. I mean, that wasn't really a trick of fate, but it was the other side of my life. I was a political radical, and, I ended up living in the African-American community in Greensboro, North Carolina, working at A&T State University. And so being in medieval studies just didn't line up with the radical politics I was in. And one thing and another, and through that time, I was reading Carl Jung's work. I started out reading Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I ended up being very interested in The Great Mother and Erich Neumann's work. And again, all of this was just kind of a sidebar in my life because nobody else around me was doing it. And I didn't think that it would end up being my profession because I thought it was more like a hobby that I was reading this stuff, trying to figure out what had happened to me and what had happened to my father, et cetera. And then eventually, and it's all kind of a long story, what I really ended up in was Zen Buddhism. And I became a formal Zen practitioner, 1970, 1971. I took the Bodhisattva vows. I started practicing. It was a completely different world, I mean, that I was entering into. And again, that was the early 70s. And my teacher, Philip Kapleau, had gone to Japan for 14 years and come back then, but with a very narrow sense of what he was teaching. And so I was learning a very narrow sense of Zen Buddhism, but I was so interested in the human mind. I was just interested in what is this? And in a way, the early days of practice answered that in a certain way, because it was a very severe, disciplined kind of practice. And there wasn't any kind of intellectual overview. And so then I could see things from my own experience. However, again, nobody really had the map, not Kapleau either, because he was in a way too American, and he went to Japan when he was 42, I think. So he already was a businessman, and there was a certain overlay of being a businessman on his particular approach. So, but I spent 4 years really focusing on Zen practice, trying to master what I was learning, and also trying to integrate it into my ordinary life. And then I realized that the people that were there at the Zen Center, apart from Kapleau, many of them had psychological problems, and I could experience that partly because I'd had a father that had psychological problems. I could see that there was a gap between the way that they were sort of pretending to be, kind of like pretending to be a Buddha kind of thing, and the way they were actually emotionally. And I began to see that gap in myself. And so I went to Kapleau and said, I want to go to personal psychotherapy. And at that point, he would not allow people to be his students and to be in personal psychotherapy, because he thought that was following two masters. So I had to say, like, bye-bye for now, because I need to go to personal psychotherapy. And so then once I went into personal therapy, I then became very, very interested in, eventually I saw June Singer, who is was a Jungian analyst in Chicago. And, I was also at that time already going to graduate school, first in clinical social work, then I switched to psychology, then I got really very interested in becoming a psychologist and becoming a psychotherapist. And it wasn't as though I was uninterested in Buddhism, but I just stopped being so deeply in the Buddhist community for quite a while, for like 10 years. I kind of dropped out of that. I practiced a little on my own. I read Buddhism. And then eventually I became an academic at Bryn Mawr College, and I was a developmental psychologist. And I stayed at Bryn Mawr until I got tenure, and then I left after I got tenure. And in part, again, because at root, I'm a really serious explorer, seeker in regard to human consciousness. And even if I master certain ways of being, or I can even publish in those fields, unless I feel that I am myself doing what I feel that is my own dedication or my own raison d'etre, or whatever you want to call it, if I feel it's off track, I'll change my life and go onto the track. So I've been on, honestly, the big tracks I've been on, the biggest one is Buddhism, because through all of the years, and now through these recent years, I live in a small retreat center. I've studied early Buddhism now. I have really a grasp of Zen, Vipassana, and something called POA, which is transfer of consciousness at the time of death. So I practiced all of those things. And my my home includes a home office, and I see people in therapy here, and I see individuals and couples, and over time I've done analysis on the couch and individual analysis. But what my life has kind of boiled down to through all of this is, and this, it sounds preposterous, but I'm just going to say it, a dedication to ending war. And I believe I understand from everything that my life has been about why human beings kill each other rather than speak to each other, and why it's so hard to stop doing that, even though I think everyone who's involved in war and everyone who contemplates war agrees that it's grotesque. Like, we shouldn't be doing this. But then if you look back, like Harari does in *Sapiens*, over the history of Homo sapiens, they've pretty much been at war since they've been on Earth. And they have also defeated and killed the other hominid species that were here. And so as a species, we're extremely violent and aggressive. And yet we have the option not to be. And so, to me, what my life has taught me through all of this very long blah, 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 that, kind of starts with my father actually being pretty aggressive. He was never violent, but he was pretty aggressive at night in attacking us. And me understanding that people suffer from what we call mental illness because they're in different states of mind from most people, walking around people. And then going through that, getting into Buddhism, trying to understand what is the situation we're in? Why are we so trapped in suffering? And then from there, I got a lot of graduate education, and then I had the privilege of teaching at Bryn Mawr. I loved teaching there, but ultimately, once I got tenure, I was going to be stuck with the same 25 people for the rest of my life, and I could see that the conflicts we were having as a faculty were like a family. They were just the same conflicts every week, but we weren't going to be going through family therapy, and so I feel I feel very, very happy that I taught at Bryn Mawr, very happy that I had wonderful students, and my time there was about 12 years. I taught there and the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital, and yet I'm also happy that I left. I didn't really get stuck in a life where I had to kind of go through the whole rigmarole of keeping, myself in publications and so on in a certain way. So ultimately, I've had a very privileged life from the point of view. I've met tremendous teachers. I've had mentors and teachers throughout all of my life. All of them now have died, pretty much. Not everybody, but my bigger ones have died. Shinzen Young, who's been one of my teachers, he's still alive. But it's like I've had this privilege, this kind of view into human knowledge and wisdom, and I've had a kind of intelligence that was allowing me to understand things in a somewhat preternatural way. It's not the typical, I didn't do it a step-by-step kind of thing. And because of that, I feel like I do need to return the favor in some way, that I need to do my best to end war, at this point in my life. And that's why I've started this Center for Real Dialogue. And I started first as a for-profit kind of consulting thing, and then realized it wasn't going to work, particularly because I live on a mountain in Vermont. And then I shifted it over to a nonprofit, and now we have some possibilities. We have some interesting possibilities that are just now developing with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, and about free speech, because we're really about speech. That's really what we're about, because actually humans have a capacity to speak about their differences and to also use their self-awareness to monitor their own feelings and thoughts so that they can keep their ears open. We do have that capacity, but we often don't use it. So we don't have to use the fight or flight instinct. Animals do have to use it. It's just instinct for them. For us, all of our instincts, we can modify through our awareness. but we often don't. And so, with this option that we could not kill each other, even though we're very offended or insulted or humiliated by the other side, that option, I think, I think it is our superpower. And I think it is what would allow human consciousness to continue in what the Buddha called this world cycle. That's samsara. That's the world we're in, space-time. Whatever you want to call it here, it's a finite world. And but human consciousness is the highest level of consciousness in this finite world, because we can be aware of our awareness. We're not just stuck in awareness. We can be aware of the awareness, so we can then change our actions even in a moment. And that's what allows us to have freedom. And yet with all of that available to us, there's a really deep problem. And that problem is that we emotionally want to control each other. And it's not just like a desire. It feels like we have to do that. And there are ways that I can, talk about all of this from a Jungian perspective as well as from a Buddhist perspective, because I'm very kind of literate in both approaches, and I like both approaches. They're different, but they also have interfaces that are interesting. So anyway, I've just talked for a long time. So
no, that's okay. I mean, I was following along. I thought, it's all very interesting. There's a million different directions we can go, but I'm glad that you kind of pinpointed it on this one topic of ending war. Or, I often think about individuals, or I think about the psyche, the human psyche, as, you could look at it as an individual, or you could look at it as the collective. And it seems that the problems are the same. The energies and the archetypes are the same. The approaches could be the same. And so when you start talking about real dialogue or any kind of conflict resolution, or just working through problems with one person or two people, that is the start of working through it on a much broader level, because it's gonna come down to the same types of, like you're saying, managing your emotions, managing that thing inside of us that wants to react instantly because that's our instinct, the ability to hold back from that and think through it, put yourself, like an animal's never able to put themselves in another animal's shoes.
Exactly.
But that is the thing, just like you're saying, that is the thing that probably, you said it as we're the highest form of consciousness, but it's also the thing that gets us the closest to some kind of divinity or some kind of actual, something bigger, something greater, something deeper. So I think it's all, I want to go down that rabbit hole. I also just thought it was really interesting, just your experience, like your experience growing up with your father. I can imagine somebody like yourself being, if you're isolated and you're in this situation, but you have this intelligence enough to, you're obviously just an observer. You're like seeing things and you're going, am I the only one seeing this? And, in a real way, I can connect with you on that, because that's very similar to how I grew up. I mean, it's, I think in the end, it's why I gravitated towards reading so much and wanting to write, and then also wanting to have conversations like this, because the dialogue, like I've had so much more dialogue in my head going, well, what, asking myself questions, trying to figure things out, seeking answers, And so, I appreciate you sharing it all, but also it's fun to see somebody who, I'm sure it wasn't always fun for you, but at the same time, you were an explorer and a seeker. And I think that's really what this is all about for me as well.
Yeah, well, just the way you're speaking about it, I can tell we have a similarity. And for me, having gotten on the Buddhist path so early was really, really helpful. But I truly didn't understand my own individual situation in my family of origin, I couldn't make sense of it from a psychoanalytic point of view. But finally, when I studied what's called POA, which is the transfer of consciousness at the time of death, it's a Tibetan practice, and it's based on the Tibetan views of birth and death. And by all those markers, and also really by what the Dalai Lama writes about karma, my life is extremely karmically designed. It's not a life that can be easily explained by, the family I was born into or the situation I was in. In fact, what was troubling to me when I was first in psychoanalytic therapy was that all of the therapists I saw, because I saw several, wanted to try to explain my mind in terms of the psychogenetics, the people that I was born to, essentially. Now, there are aspects of my mind that definitely, have been caught by complexes that have to do, particularly my relationship with my mother. But still, there were aspects to my inquiry that things I was interested in, and my early dreams and so on, that were far more transpersonal or archetypal, if you want to say that. And there was no way I could explain them until, when I met the Rinpoche the Rinpoche that I studied with two in regard to this practice. But the older one, who's very world famous as the world master of POA, he has died now. When I met him, really the first day I met him, he said something about me that he couldn't have known. And then later, after I practiced a bit, he drew me aside and said I was a Vajrayana practitioner in a recent lifetime. And he said it in a way that was not personal to me. He was never interested in me personally. He was interested in the mind that I was presenting in the practice. And it was that mind that he was responding to. And eventually I went to India and I practiced with him there. I never completely fulfilled what he was asking of me because of the lifetime I'm in right now. I couldn't stop taking care of the people I was taking care of to practice with him in India, or even to stay for any period of time. And he wasn't interested very much at all in my life as it is. So, I could tell at that point that a lot of my privileges in life were based on my spiritual ancestors who had practiced various things that now I have had access to, but I didn't begin at the beginning of those practices, and nor did my parents have anything to do with those things at all. And I think being able to get a view like that gives me also a bigger view of the meaning of my life, the meaning of other people's lives, even the meaning of my children's lives, because I realize my children, I know them in a certain way, but I don't know them in another way. And all of that has given me a bigger way of looking at even the collective unconscious, or, Jung's psychology, archetypes. And, I'll just say this, we don't need to go into it, but there is a form of early Buddhism that's like 3rd to 5th century Indian Buddhism that's called Yogacara. And it's like yoga and then C-A-R-A with a little tail on the C. And that form of Buddhism has a model of mind that's very much like Jung's model of mind. And of course, it's much older than analytical psychology, but the two sync up pretty well. And because of that, I try also to let regular people know, you can grow up in the working class, you can grow up with people that, like, my parents didn't go to high school. I was the first person in my extended family to graduate high school. And then I went on to get 2 master's degrees and a Ph.D. I became a psychoanalyst, and I've written now 20 books. Hello, you can go on. Don't hold yourself back by your beginnings, because also difficult beginnings can be spiritual opening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've been sensing that a lot in my own life. Certain people around me who it's like a trap to think that, hey, this is where I came from, and so this is who I am. And there's just too much identification with whatever you think is your personality. And
yes.
And even for me, so like my early, say the first 30 years of my life, I really was very introverted. And so I considered myself an introvert. And while sometimes labels can be helpful in figuring out what's going on, I think that at this point in my life, I've become so much more extroverted. And so to just keep saying that I'll always be that same introverted personality, it's just actually not helpful. It's more like, I think of Alan Watts just talking about flowing like water. And it's just so much nicer for yourself. Like your life is just so much more enjoyable, and you feel so much more engaged with life when you can drop the labels and just kind of do what you want to do in a moment, and like just be who you want to be, say what you want to say, pursue what you want to pursue. And labels like that, like labels like introvert, extrovert, or even, a lot of what are considered the neurodivergent labels today, the ADHD, PTSD, the bipolar, all of those labels are the same thing. If you attach yourself to them, then you will always be controlled by them. But if you see them as, they are from a Joseph Campbell perspective, that's the call to the journey. That's the thing that if you can approach it, you can work through it. And then you become, the complexes that you developed when you're younger, they don't affect you the same way. And so you feel so much less burdened. You feel so much more free. I find myself, when I was young, I had so much social anxiety, even into my 30s. And I always found myself when I was around other people, just in my head, just thinking about how uncomfortable I was and how, oh, this person doesn't get me. That person can't see me for who I am. And, once I was able to work through some things for myself, really just process some things, I find myself in these social situations where I'm being very extroverted and I'm not even thinking about it. I'm just kind of flowing in the moment. And it's just such a better way to live, to just release yourself of the mask that you've managed to put on. Just, get rid of it and just be in a moment. And I also find it very interesting from your story, obviously coming from a Roman Catholic family in America, very Western, very Westernized. And so you end up, like a lot of us, with a Western mentality of, I think a lot about the differences in East and West, the 2 stories of the garden, the Adam and Eve versus the Buddha meditating under the Bodhi tree. And in the West, we partook of this tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it really sent us down this course where the ego took control, because we have this idea that we know what's right, we know what's correct, we know what's wrong. And in the East, the Buddha, rather than partake of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it's as if he partook of the tree of life. And in your search, you came from this Western world, and what seems to have really helped balance you out and help you figure things out was to step into that other garden and partake of that other tree, to try to, rather than rely on your ego to control everything, but to take the Eastern path and kind of let that ego go and kind of balance yourself out. I don't know, you could speak to whether or not that's true, but I find that it's interesting that you didn't just become one of those people who wholesale dove into it and just kind of put on a new mask, but you were able to kind of balance the two and use them to move yourself forward.
Well, I like the way you're speaking, and you're opening a lot of, let's say, insight into the ideas of labels and rabbit holes and so on. And so I'm just going to try to build on that a little and say, one reason why I bring out my stories sometimes right now in this moment of time is that there's been so much emphasis on trauma, what I call the trauma conversation. I get so tired of it because actually trauma can be resilience. And everybody goes through a door of suffering. There isn't, I mean, this is a Buddhist insight, but that's the first noble truth, is that life being here, samsara, space-time, is incomplete and difficult. It's off balance. That's its nature. That's not your personal deal. And so you were here, you basically signed the contract. You're going to die. When you came in, you signed the contract, whether you like it or not. And that threw you off really at the beginning even. But let's just say we're in a situation, all of us, where things are not ideal. And then whatever version of the not ideal we got, it's a good idea to look closely at that because it has to do with you personally. There's your karma. There's your particular snow globe. We call it a snow globe in Real Dialogue, which is the way that you experience seeing and hearing and feeling, and also the conditions that you're in. Everybody's in conditions, right?
Yeah, that's interesting because I always you use the word snow globe, but I often refer to it as bubbles. Everybody's in the bubble.
Yes, a bubble was what I used in the beginning, and then somebody I saw in therapy came up with a snow globe, and I like that better because you shake it up and you look at your own snow then as soon as it's shaken up.
Yeah, that's great.
But this idea of trauma, or let's say difficult conditions, difficulty at the beginning is one of the hexagrams in the I Ching. Actually, it can portend for very good things, but you have to take it in stride based on something that allows you to see what it means. And what I could say for myself, what was it that sort of saved me or kept me from drowning in a situation that did include a lot of domestic violence. We lived next door to 5 of my cousins and my father's brother, and there was a situation there where people were physically, fighting with each other, and my parents didn't do that, but I certainly saw a lot of it. But, in a way I was protected. And here's the thing that I think protected me. I think I understood and also could experience extreme mental illness. I think I, from the beginning, saw that the mind is not the consensual world. I never believed that the visible world was all that was going on. And I had various experiences that, you could call spiritual experiences, or you could call them psychotic experiences. And they meet both the criteria. And I have, the style of my own mind is more psychotic than it is neurotic. And I, certainly sensed that when I was working at the Cuyahoga County State Mental Hospital as a 15-year-old, and I felt at ease with people that were very mentally ill. They seemed to be my people, and but I didn't know what to do. I mean, I knew that I also knew that I wasn't captured by that state of mind. I knew that it was available, but I wasn't captured by it. Now, I think each of us has circumstances that we need to pay attention to at the point that we become conscious of the door that's opening for us. And I think I became conscious of it starting around 15. And then by the time I went through the Zen training, I gradually realized I have to study psychology because I have grown up with mental illness. I probably had mental illness myself, but I need to see what it means. I mean, I knew that diagnostic categories were helpful maps, but weren't really giving you a final word on people. I knew that just intuitively. So again, that was part of what saved me. And so, what I want people to see is whatever their own particular constriction is, whatever hurts them or harms them or whatever, it might be their door. As you said, the beginning of the adventure. Now, sometimes situations are really just harmful and you have to get out of them. But even those situations are often major teachers. They're not throwaways. So, the idea that the way that it gets translated, this teaching of the Buddha, the First Noble Truth, gets translated as life is suffering, but it really should be translated, living here is really imperfect. And the imperfections of your life are your particular doors. That's where you're going to help. That's where you're going to gain knowledge about the world. And that might lead you to being an engineer, or it might lead you to being a doctor, or it might lead you to being a plumber. Whatever it is that you are led to from your suffering is important and important to pursue. And I think where I was led ultimately was to the issue of war. Like, what is war? Why do people kill each other? And I have a whole story about that as well, because I didn't realize that people literally killed each other until my father told me when I was 7 years old about the war that he was in. And he didn't tell me sit down and tell me a story. He told me in bits and pieces, but I gradually realized that he had seen people killed, and he might have showed me pictures of concentration camps. I have some vague memory of that I saw piles of bodies and so on. And then I realized that war was a situation where human beings willingly, intentionally killed each other, and that-that's what they were doing there. And that completely freaked me out. I mean, I did then become an elective mute. I stopped talking for like 8 months. It drove everybody crazy. I mean, this was after the school had given me the IQ test and so on, and now I'm not talking. And, my teacher, my mother, and like I said, my mother didn't drive, so she'd have to ride with me in the car with my uncle to school. And everybody kind of went crazy over my not talking. But I felt like I can't do it here. Wherever I've landed, the people kill each other, that this is what's happening here. I just can't make this shift from wherever I was to this thing. I don't want to be in this thing. And so, that's it. It looked like too much. So, I want to kind of shift from this because I think it's a very important point, but I don't want to miss what we do in Real Dialogue. And I don't know where we are in the interview, but.
Yeah, I think that's actually, I think you did a good job of circling back around, because I did want to get back to Real Dialogue. And even if it's your own personal story, it seems like you gave up speaking, and then eventually you came to a point where you're like, no, I've got to figure out how to talk. And I would love to hear about that. Like what, maybe the idea of the way that you explain Real Dialogue, and then, how people, just what the process you go through in teaching people how to employ it in their own life.
Yeah, I will speak about that. So I was 7 years old when I became, it's called a selective mute now, used to be called elective mute. I stopped talking, and that was the first time I ever felt powerful. When people look at a child who's not speaking, they might feel the child is powerless. But actually, when you stop speaking and you decide you're not going to speak, nobody can make you speak. And so all these people were trying to make me talk, and I didn't. And I wasn't going to, because I began to explore my mind in a more, let's say, nonverbal way. And I was getting somewhere. I realized that war was wrong. I realized that I was a child and that I knew that war was wrong. And so I then had fantasies of teaching grown-ups how wrong it is. And it was a childish fantasy. It was like standing on a soapbox, just telling people, but I was going into that and I just didn't want to talk about ordinary things. I didn't want to do what the second grade was offering. It just seemed so trivial by comparison. But as time passed there, I started noticing that the adults around me were freaking out in various ways. And eventually, I heard my parents talking, and they were going to send me to a psychiatrist at Akron University. I grew up in Akron, Ohio. And it seems to me that I knew what the word meant because I knew I was going to be in trouble. And I knew that if I continued with this not talking thing, I was probably going to be in a lot of trouble that I didn't want to be in. And so it was because of that that I started to force myself to talk again. But here's something happened. So before I came back to talking, I had been extremely socially awkward and extremely introverted. And really, even looking at photographs of myself from that kindergarten, first grade period, it's painful to look at the photographs. I just look like I look like I'm neurodivergent or whatever, I just don't look right. But then when I started speaking again, it was like the words started coming to me. And in a way that almost I realized that if I just listened in my inner ear, kind of, I knew how to answer questions that people were asking, even if I hadn't really studied that thing, as long as I listened, I could answer in a way that engaged the teacher or whatever. And then I began to be able to write also in a way that people praised a great deal by teachers. So I somehow contacted what in Buddhism is called prajna. It's the wisdom that flows through everybody. Most people stop it with what we call the ego. They don't allow it to emerge. Say somebody like Bob Dylan, who is a figure who has been just indefatigable as a creative artist, he knows about it. He talked about it in his interview. I can't remember who it was that directed him in this fairly recent movie since he wrote his the first chapter or the first book of his autobiography. Anyway, he says, he said, in those 2 years when I wrote those songs, it was God writing the songs. He said, I was writing them, I couldn't even write them down fast enough. I was writing them down on napkins and things because they're coming to me. I wasn't thinking them up. And it's that kind of flow-through aspect to the human mind that we have access to this, that I began to get access to when I started speaking again. And so then, as that developed and as I kind of, could ride that horse and humanize it, I got very, very good in school, but then I even became popular. I mean, it was just weird to me. Like I had shifted from this weirdness to then being, nominated for homecoming queen or whatever. The homecoming queen thing did not fit me, really. But I was also pleased that people liked me, because I'd been so odd and still my grades were so good that people hated me for them, which I eventually could understand even while I was experiencing it. Because it was like this stuff came to me and nobody else was seeming to be able to do that. And I couldn't figure out why they weren't doing it. But, there is this flow. It's like the flow through tea bag kind of thing that you were also aware of, that when you're in the moment and you're engaged, and like I'm engaged with you, something comes. And it's not that I'm thinking it up. I'm just following it. And that something is, I think, the unified mind. It's our access to the mind of God, if you want to call it that, or, the Buddha nature, or the Dharmakaya, or whatever other language we have for it. The Tao, I guess, is another one. But you can block it out very easily by, first of all, wanting to get control of things, and then especially wanting to get control of other people. By I mean, I have to say that I have a complex life. My husband died from early onset Alzheimer's, and that was in he began to get ill when he was in his 50s. It was a tragedy, but I learned a lot from it. And he was also a Zen practitioner, so he took it well. We went through it well. But now I have a new partner. I have adult children. I have a complex life. And sometimes I try to control these people because I want them to do the things I want them to do. And I can just feel the disappearance of my wisdom. It just shrinks right up. And there I am, just with me.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, before we started recording, I said, hey, I don't have an agenda. I don't have somewhere I need to get to in the conversation. I always have some bullet points and things that I can bring up, to keep the conversation rolling. And I want to talk about, what my guests are doing and what's interesting to them. But really, so that's how this conversation has gone, right? Is we kind of just said, okay, let's go with the flow. And that's honestly, for me, when conversation becomes the most interesting, it becomes the best conversation. Because if you really are, well, there's probably two parts to it. One is that the way that I view conversation is, in my own mind, I have this stream of thoughts and I have maybe some level of control, but you only have control once the original idea gets there. Before that comes into your mind, you're just kind of waiting as if you're an antenna waiting to pick up a signal. And then once it starts flowing, you can kind of choose which channel to turn it to. But what I love about conversation is that I get to turn off my channel and tune into somebody else's. It's if you really think about what good kind of real, genuine conversation is, it's you're tuning yourself into the flow of consciousness in somebody else's mind. And that's beautiful to me. It's like the most fun. And especially, so the second part, I guess, is especially when the person you're talking to can achieve that state that you're talking about, that free flow, just saying what comes to them in a way where they're not even sure where it's coming from. It's amazing because as two people, you get to experience that flow together. And that's when you start saying things that are original thoughts. You start synthesizing ideas together in a way that you've never heard other people say them, but all of a sudden you're saying them. And to me, I just love it. I'm a lover of words. I really love to read and to write. And in the same way, you get that flow going. And when you write something that surprises you, or you say something that surprises you, or you're in a conversation with somebody and they synthesize ideas in a way that you've never heard them before, for me, there's no, that is thrill. That's like, oh, we are living right now because we're creating in the moment, or we're discovering in the moment. So I love it.
That's perfectly expressed. I also agree with everything you've said, and I do think it's happening, between us. And it's a surprising thing because, of course, I've never met you before. I had no idea why we were meeting.
That's a great point. And also, you also discover that when you come across somebody who's open enough and explorative enough, that there also is this strange thing where age also kind of disappears, where it doesn't matter if somebody's very young and somebody else has a lot more experience. When people are on a similar kind of trajectory, then that flow can occur very, very easily.
Absolutely. And again, the words that humans have put to that, like, Buddha nature, mind of God, Dharmakaya, Tao, everybody that recognizes that it's a vital force, and that vitality stays alive through the entire lifetime. And yet people that don't recognize that attribute the vitality to babies or young children or puppies or kittens. So they're like, they're happy to see a baby, but they're not happy to see an older person because they see the vitality in the baby, but that same vitality is there through the whole life. And, unfortunately, often humans block out the idea that everybody has it, but I do want to change the channel to the issue of real dialogue and the problem that humans have. So first of all, what you said a moment ago about two people discovering sort of new truth, and that truth being the result of conversation and dialogue, to me is very, very key, because I believe, I would say, I don't just believe, I feel like I want to testify or something, that human consciousness is dyadic. I don't think it's solo. And I think we've made in our psychologies a lot of mistakes in this recent period of time by looking at the solo brain in trying to figure out the nature of consciousness. And there's so much to say about that I don't have time to say. But what I think the key thing is, if people could realize that the brain, our brain, my brain, is an organ inside of my head. It is not my consciousness. And it's more like a filter that I'm filtering the field of consciousness. And then when I'm relating to another human, particularly if I can relate, like you and I are sort of eye to eye, but we're also kind of filtered through a screen. But if I can relate in the eye to eye, that's the original unit of the human, because we come here inside of somebody else. And we become conscious of our surroundings, particularly through the perception of hearing, around 4 months intrauterine. Infants can experience their mother's voice and prefer it. So that means they're conscious of the mother's voice as different from other voices, and they also recognize their own language. There are a lot of different tests now that are made, even of infants that are intrauterine. So we become conscious early, but when we're born, somebody has to look us in the face and more or less say, I see you, you are there. And that starts a process that then culminates at around 2 years old with the development of what are called the self-conscious emotions. The emotions like embarrassment, guilt, shame, pride, hubris, envy, jealousy. These are human emotions. The animals do not have these emotions. They develop automatically in humans, but what happens there? So they're archetypal, they're built-in feature, but they rely on relationship. You have to have a relationship with caregivers to have this come on board, this self-consciousness. But then to bring about the recognition of a self, there has to be an awareness like, I see and I know I see. And the reason I know I see is that you see that I see, and you tell me, oh, I see that you see that apple. You point to the apple, you see that I'm seeing the apple, and you might say apple. And then I know that you see, and I know that I see, and I know that you know that I see. And then eventually I know that you know that I know that I see. So, that sense of self comes on board kind of late. Before that, there's not a strong division between inside and outside. And there's not a strong division between subject and object. So it starts to formulate around 2 years old. So you get kids at 2 years old, personal pronouns come into use, I, me, mine. And also the sense of possessing something, this is mine. The recognition, I did the drawing. And then also the capacity to pretend. Because we perceive ourselves now as essentially split between something like a me and an I. Like, me, I recognize all sorts of things, but then I know that I recognize them. And then also I know that you know that I recognize them. This whole setup leads to our capacity to abstract ourselves, to say, take a pen and spin it around as though it's a helicopter. And that child of about 2.5 knows it's not a helicopter. They know it's a pen, but they pretend and play that it's a helicopter. That's the beginning of our imagination, of our ability to create things that we haven't seen, and then to get others to validate, yes, that makes sense. You could make a helicopter out of that. So this sense of creativity, imagination, the development of our ability to grow and, let's say, engage in what we call the world is dyadic and requires dyadic witnessing, and it requires dyadic engagement. We cannot do it solo. And even if, you are a hermetic monk in the Himalayas, you're having some mind-to-mind transmission with your teacher to check out whether you're deceiving yourself or whether you're actually on the path. Because humans have many different organizations in their minds. Jung called them psychological complexes. Each one has sort of an emotional center. Only one of them is the one associated with I. There are others in there that are making trouble that are not associated with I, that get in the way sometimes. And, you say things you hadn't intended to say. So this complicated subjectivity of being human is just a lot to operate with, but it does require the dyadic engagement. And in this period of time that we're in right now, we've gotten so distracted by neuroscience into the idea of the brain, consciousness coming from the brain having these different parts, and where does it originate, et cetera, et cetera. And, while I've learned neuroscience, I have to teach it to some extent, I think it's the wrong path to go down. And then there's one final piece to this. There is no functional MRI that can put two brains together and see what happens when they talk to each other. There is not a single test using any kind of scan that can do two brains together. And that really limits neuroscience, right? Because it can only do one brain, and then they can put various kinds of stimuli. They can show the person a movie or something, but that's not the same as you and I talking to each other. So there is no scan of you and I talking to each other. It doesn't exist. And so we have to build...
just so I understand, you don't mean like scanning two people simultaneously while they're talking. You're talking about the actual interaction, being able to see.
I'm talking about scanning two brains simultaneously. They can't do it.
Help me understand.
Why not?
Yeah, why is that? Why is there not the device where you could do?
I'm not an engineer, but I could say that if they could have built an MRI machine for two people, they would have. So it must have to do with the way that the waves bounce off of the this or that. It gets too confusing.
If you put them next to each other, they might interfere.
I think so.
Like
I mean,
okay.
Again, like this, I'm no engineer, I'm no physicist.
But as of yet, we haven't done it.
It ain't so. It ain't so. And I don't believe that probably we can do it because for a variety of reasons. But I'm kind of hoping that people recognize we can't do that, because actually having two people in conversation and being able to see how that works, and also the discovery of this kind of rapid interaction through what you might call the wisdom factor. Jung called it like the self with a big S. I really don't like that word because I think it's misleading because it sounds so solo. I think, I don't know, I have a lot of speculation about this, but one of my big speculations is that a lot of the keepers of the code, the speakers, the writers of the canons and so on, by far have been men. They haven't had babies. They don't know the baby thing. They were babies, but they don't remember it. But, I've had babies. I've had babies. I've had an ectopic pregnancy. I know what the baby thing is like. I've had babies. I've had stepchildren. I'm a developmental psychologist, but I've been in the trenches. And I can tell you that it's different from the way it's described by any neuroscientist and anybody who's looking at the brain. And I don't care if it's even, Ian Gilchrist or anybody else. They don't understand how dyadic it is and how you can't, it's basically in some ways as a mother, you cannot stop looking at your baby. I mean, you're absolutely at the beginning hypnotized by this being that you have to look at all the time. Now, I assume that's nature, that's human nature that has designed it that way because that baby needs that, And so I'm trying to kind of put together here a whole puzzle to say that, so the formation of the human self leads us to make a lot of mistakes about other people. We think we know what other people's intentions are by looking at them. Oh, you're angry with me. Or I can tell that you feel hostile towards me. No, you can't. You really can't. Even though in the beginning you thought or you experienced, well, I know I see the apple because you see the apple. And you know that I see the apple, and I know that you see the apple, and we both know that the other person knows that too. Yes, we needed all of that to be able to create the sense, I am in here and the world is out there. Now, that was a sense that we had to create because of the complexity of the human brain. It has to go there. And Erich Neumann's, The Origins of Consciousness, I think that's what it's called, because I get it confused with The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of Bicameral Mind, but that's a different book. But Erich Neumann's Origins of Consciousness basically says there has to be a driver, there has to be a central office, for humans, because the whole thing is just too complex. And we get the central office, and it starts around the age of 2. It finishes developing by the age of 21 to 25, where we have that sense that we can drive our car, we can drive our ship, we're the captain of our ship, we have sovereignty over our own lives because we can govern ourselves. And that's a long development, and it requires language, and it requires culture, and it requires lots of other people, but it starts in the dyad. And so, we make the mistake that we can read other people's minds, that we can read other people's faces. We cannot. And so there's that. That's one problem for humans. Our theory of mind is kind of like Swiss cheese. Like we've got too many holes in it, and we've got to fix the holes. And then the other thing that is a big problem is, okay, before 2, during the period where we don't have language and where we don't have culture, and when we're not in any way, individuals, we have to take emotional control of other people to get our needs met. We have to get the food, and we have to get the attention, and we have to get the care that we need. So we master emotional control of other people before we get language and individual experience. And so all of us are masters of emotional control of other people. And, we don't know that that's what we're doing, but, and also it is honestly a completely delusional kind of thing. Like, I won't be able to breathe if you don't clean out the garage. I've asked you 6 times and I can't ask you once more. I mean, that whole trauma is unnecessary, but the person experiencing it thinks, this is my gut. My gut is telling me, I can't go forward. I can't trust this person because I asked him to clean the garage 15 times and he never did it. And then you talk to the other person, he goes, I don't even know which room is the garage. I don't know what this person is talking about. I thought I did it. I thought I did what they were asking. And they keep going after me about something that I don't get it. I don't know. And that's a very typical human interaction between people that care about each other even, much less the people that are out there politically who are drumming up whatever it is they're drumming up about the other side.
Yeah. People who speak different languages, come from different cultures, have different incentives. I could see that.
So it's very easy
painful.
for us to create enemies.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's very easy for us to then condemn the other person and say, this person has caused me, so much grief, and I can't go forward, or it's not even this person. I mean, honestly, whatever the Trump derangement syndrome is, or whatever it is that grabs people. I mean, I can speculate about what it is, just because Trump is a trickster figure. And he grabs people in whatever it is that they're wanting to be grabbed at, and and then they have these reactions, and the reactions are completely projective.
Yeah, and they seem to go. They seem to go both directions as well. Where the Trump derangement syndrome is often, that label is given to people who are on the left who are angry at Trump.
Right.
But the same thing is happening to the people on the right who think he's some kind of savior figure.
Like a god or something. Yeah. So, I mean, he is a figure. I must say that when he first started running for political office, I thought he'll never, I mean, I couldn't imagine anybody voting for. I mean, I remembered him back in the day when he was hanging around with various kinds of rap stars in New York. I was in New York for that period of time, and he was like a real estate person. And, I was never interested in him. It didn't seem that interesting. And then anyway, it like kept rolling, this ball called Trump, until the point, like, to me, what was fascinating is that the other side tried to squash him, kill him, jail him, arrest him, shoot him. I mean, they've done so many things that he actually survived, that I began to get interested in him.
That's exactly my story with it too, because before that I wasn't really even interested in politics. I saw it as the right and the left, and then it was it was actually their attempts to do everything you just said, put him in jail, bankrupt him, discredit him, shoot him. It was those things that made me go like, well, why are they so against this guy? And
yes, and also, how can he survive all this? How could anybody? I mean, like even like 1/100th of that would have killed me. I mean, just that all that sort of smashing down of him seemed to allow him to, I don't know, come back. I truly do not completely understand his personality, except now I would say it is the trickster archetype. It is entirely the trickster. And when I read somewhere not long ago, and I read a number of alternative sources on Substack and so on, but somebody said, Trump is like our first gay president. I mean, he's like Liberace. He has a Liberace style. He kind of tiptoes around, and he's got a cheerful attitude, and that just sort of clicked in my mind. It's like I never took seriously his style, but it is a Liberace style. And when I look back at Liberace, I was a child, and my mother liked Liberace. And of course, I didn't know anything about gay or anything, but I thought it was weird that Liberace had all of this sort of elaborate stuff that looked a little grotesque to me, that was so different from anything that we had in our home. But I think she was drawn to the way that it was so elaborate.
Yeah,
and I think there must be
presentation
people,
in a way.
the presentation of it, yeah. So, but the thing about Trump is that, let's say, as an object of projection, he's a tremendous hook. And what people project depends on what's going on with them, but they think it's Trump. And so he's like a good study from the point of view of he's out there, and everybody has a chance to sort of see him. And I think it is a study of the trickster. And I don't think there's ever been another politician in my lifetime who has represented so many things and seemed to, like a cartoon, be beaten down over here and then come back over here and then be beaten down again and come back again. And to me, that's kind of fascinating. But the way that this comes back to real dialogue is that when in Trump's first term and when he was running even, I began to see that even my Buddhist friends and the people around me in this very liberal progressive place I live, Vermont, were starting to become hostile in a way that I'd never seen before. And they were saying very hostile things about those people who were voting for Trump, most of whom we weren't meeting, in our neighborhoods or anything. And I began to wonder what's happening to these folks. And I started seeing this splitting and then this organization of, I have to go after this. It's like the enemy. And I can't let it go because it's so bad. And because it was people that otherwise I hadn't seen this kind of behavior from, I started seeing how much that is like a couple. I've done lots and lots of couples therapy, and I've met with people thousands of hours, and now I've facilitated a lot of contentious conversations. And I can tell you that everybody is a human being. They're all human. They've all had families. They've all grown up. They all have reasons for believing what they believe, and all of those reasons are understandable. And once I feel that and see that, I love them. I don't care what their ideas are. I can see how they got to these ideas. I see why they care about the ideas. And then, with the suffering of life, everybody has been beaten down by life. And everybody wants happiness for their families and children and so on. And everybody is vulnerable and limited. And really, real dialogue is a method of speaking and listening that brings out the human subjective side and does not allow the dehumanizing projection that's called in psychoanalytic literature projective identification. It's splitting and idealization. And basically what it is a splitting of the opposites, the good, bad opposites. And then there's only the good side and the bad side. So real dialogue does not allow that split to take place. And it keeps people kind of in their lanes as human beings, speaking just for themselves, listening mindfully. But the speaking for yourself, you have to speak, this is the way I remember it. This is the way I understand it. Instead of this is the way it is. And instead of saying we, because the we is always the royal we, it's the I, and it's not the you. And so, when people are using this skill, which we use in facilitating the conversations, and also I teach the skill and so on, it emphasizes the subjective, the human, the vulnerable. And I then see how people are changed as a result of that. There's a relief that they can make sense of somebody else's point of view, even though they completely disagree with it. This is nothing like conflict resolution, because it's actually just allowing the two people to speak and be understood without interrupting and without closing down on that entanglement of, I have to control you because I can't breathe if you don't clean the garage.
Yeah. I've been seeing a lot of this recently. I listen to a lot of podcasts while I'm working in the yard, or, we're just doing stuff around, like go exercise or whatever, or long drives. And so I've been just recently listening to a lot of debates, and they're about big topics. They're about, the war between Russia and Ukraine, what's going on between, the war between Israel and the Palestinian or Hamas, the Palestinian people or Hamas. And everything you're saying makes a lot of sense it's similar to how, like, I have a neighbor who is very emotionally volatile, and she can just start screaming at people as if she's completely embodied her anger. And when I sit there and I look at her, I go, oh, you could see she came from somewhere that was difficult. And so all of her screaming doesn't really bother me as much as it could, because I can just see that, oh, she's just acting out in this way, which is like what you were saying earlier. But then with these debates, you get these people who are supposed to be intelligent. They're supposed to be well-informed, well-read. And what I see is a lot of people just trying to convince the other person that
they're trying to make a case to win.
Yeah, they're trying to win rather than to have an actual dialogue. Right. And so you see a lot of kind of avoidance tactics. They're supposed to be debating, and what you see them doing is literally avoiding the topic.
Yes, exactly. Well, because they're on a sidebar. I mean, it happens kind of naturally that, because the one person is not listening to the other person, and then there's an argument about a detail that ends up taking them away from whatever the main topic was. And this happens for couples as well. Yeah,
and I even see people, like, I saw a debate with Douglas Murray, who's like I know out of England, and he literally said, he was debating a libertarian, and so he said to the libertarian, you're not on the right, you're not on the left. Why don't you just pick a side? And I thought, oh God, so you don't care, like, you don't even want to be right. You just want to pick a side. And I think everything you're saying seems spot on as far as even just the starting point.
Right.
Polly, I want to point out we're about an hour and 20 minutes into this conversation. And so I know I only asked you for an hour. I'm happy to keep going, but I just want to throw that out there for you to be respectful of your time.
I was counting on an hour and a half anyway.
Okay.
And I can keep going. I'll have to stop probably in about 15 minutes or so, because I have something else that I have to do then. But I'm happy with the conversation, and I'm wanting to get around to some closure on the real dialogue part of this, because, we're this next Monday, actually, I'm going to Washington to meet with the CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE. And I'm really hoping that they will adopt some of our projects. Like, we want to do some on-stage facilitated real dialogues where you can see the two sides go through a process of being humanized. You see it every time, because the method that we use is based somewhat in psychodrama, somewhat in mindfulness, and somewhat in psychoanalysis. But it's a clear method. So it's almost like improvisational theater, and there are co-facilitators. I facilitate with somebody else. I have several co-facilitators. And we set it up so that each person gets to be understood. Sometimes we have to just interview each person with the other person listening, because they aren't able to actually be able to talk to each other. At some point in the process, each of those two people does begin to get, oh, that's the reason why the person is saying this. And then we can put them back together again, because it's really, I think that this prajna that you and I were talking about, this wisdom that flows through humans and that allows us to engage in a discovery process, that wisdom does require this kind of open channel. And if the two people have shut down into the enemy-making thing, then the wisdom can't get going. And what happens instead is, if you want to call it this, the domination of the ego. Each person wants to win, and each person feels humiliated if they don't get some kind of acknowledgement for the points they're making. And for humans, as soon as we feel that self-conscious emotion of humiliation, our response is rage. And that's one reason why say in a situation where people are already at risk for hostility, there needs to be a structure so that no one is humiliated. And the way that the DEI focus was recently going, diversity, equity, and inclusion, was calling out people's faults so that the humiliation would begin with the beginning, and then there'd be rage in response. And the humiliation rage cycle for humans is very hard to control once it gets going. You pretty much have to prevent it. And so real dialogue prevents the humiliation. We guarantee that no one's going to be humiliated when we go through this process of facilitating. And the skill of real dialogue, which, by the way, we have an online practice group every Tuesday at 1:00. It's very affordable. Our website is realdialogue.org. And even practicing, what people see is just speaking for yourself about something like, for example, what do you think the nature of consciousness is? Well, people often start out, well, it is. No, I'm asking, what are you thinking? What is your theory of it? And so just having people shape things subjectively opens a space for the whole group. And I find then anybody is willing to jump in. They're not afraid of being humiliated, because it's not as though someone's going to win. It's more that just being able to formulate, okay, this is what I'm thinking, just like you and I did at the beginning, opens up something that in those groups, which last only an hour every Tuesday, I discover so many new things talking to people who are strangers, because I would never have thought of that. I would never have formulated it that way. And all we do is speaking for yourself and listening mindfully. Sometimes we bring up topics like prompts, like a poem or a song, or sometimes we talk about whatever's happening, or sometimes we just talk about human subjectivity. So using this skill, this three-part skill, speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, remaining curious, and then learning how to do this facilitation method, which requires quite a lot of training. I mean, we have a program to train people, brings about the possibility then of dialogue opening up discovery, and even contentious dialogue opening up discovery. I mean, one of the most interesting dialogues I ever facilitated was on whether abortion should be a right or not. And there was two women, and it was another woman and I were facilitating also. I discovered so much by listening to both sides. And I would never have heard both sides. In any environment, there was always an argument for one of those sides. And so the other side never got spoken. And the woman who was arguing in favor of abortion not being a right was a woman who she works for the Navy. She's a psychologist in the Navy. She happens to be Korean American. She was adopted, and also happens to be a lesbian. I mean, she said all of this in the dialogue. The reason that she's opposed to abortion is that her mother was a prostitute in Korea and had 2 abortions before she gave birth to her. And then this woman was adopted into California to a family where she was grown up in an educated family. And ultimately, she was able to go back and meet her mother. She never met her father. Her father was an American, he's African-American, he was an American soldier in Korea. But just the fact that she had such an unusual background and she had so much information from her own life on the complexity of the issue, I mean, I was in tears and everybody else was in tears just hearing about it, because I'd never heard this way of speaking, this complexity. And then the other woman on the other side had been a Christian fundamentalist and had been opposed to abortion, but she had her 4th child and almost died, and realized that if she had died, her other 3 children would have been without a mother. And so she began to see the abortion thing differently. So the complexity of their life experiences then ended up with their positions, but their positions, when you unpacked them, were completely understandable. And they were, totally able to care about each other. And each one of them saying that they'd never had the opportunity to talk in this way. And that's just an example of it. It's an incredible thing when you see humans being able to do this.
Yeah, that's an incredible example. But at the same time, what I would suspect is that every topic that we can debate has nuance, logical nuance, emotional nuance, historical nuance. And it just seems that this approach, this real dialogue that you're talking about, it should be applied to each of us, or that we should apply it in a way where it's how we communicate with our family and friends. It's how we, as groups that have to interact, send a representative to, communicate for the groups, all the way up to these wars that, just like you, I would hope that we could end. Like we have to find, the higher version of our nature, or
yes,
in a way, what's that phrase? The better angels of our nature, or
that's
something.
right. That's right. Exactly.
And this seems like a process for doing that. Just really actually understanding that in seeking, it's part of, I also think of it as being part of being a grown-up. When you're a child, you want black and white answers. Kids crave certainty. And it makes sense, because for a child who needs to survive, they need that certainty.
Absolutely.
But part of becoming an adult, and I say this all the time, and it's actually not something that's easy to articulate for me, but I can feel it and I can see it, and I think this is a good example. But being an adult is actually to step outside of that black and white thinking and to live in paradox, where instead of saying yes or no, it's yes and yes. And I think that's actually very difficult for a lot of people because of the things that they haven't overcome, because of the conditioning of their culture or society. But that's what the world needs.
It's just because of human nature. I mean, I don't want to boil it down to cultures, because honestly, all of us had that early period before we had language where we had to take control emotionally. So all of us have the tendency to project into others that we have to control them if we feel so deeply offended or so afraid. And so in that moment, we want to create an enemy, and we want to vanquish the enemy to control that person. But when we learn this other, I hope people come to realdialogue.org, to our website, and also, we're going to be putting up online trainings very soon. We're a relatively new organization. We haven't put up online trainings, but now we have a trained faculty. Basically, what we're trying to say is that all of us have a human nature that tends towards making enemies. In order to overcome our nature, we have to use our self-awareness to stop the automatic desire to just vanquish the other person, get the other person or the other side to do what we want, and instead begin to explore the two sides and tolerate what the other side is saying in order to understand that they're also human. And that's the level of, I think, the undivided wisdom of humanity comes through when both sides are respected. I've come to believe from facilitating these conversations that I could facilitate anybody and it would make sense. I know that Hitler is often used as the example of the really awful human being, and I can't say I know much about Hitler, but I know that Hitler wanted to make a better world, and I know that the ideals that he used ended up in horrific consequences. So from my point of view, Hitler taught me not to be an idealist, but to be a humanist, not to be governed by what seems like the ideal, but instead to find out what is humane. Because I do believe that human beings can find a way to use both sides in any situation. But if we kill the other side, it's gone.
Yeah.
And then, of course, then there's the ongoing revenge and humiliation. So war will never end itself.
Yeah.
Humans have to stop it. They have to stop it.
Well,
so,
yeah, I agree. And I think it's we're not at the end of history. We're right in the middle of it. And so I think that there's a lot of, especially with the way that we've discovered so many things, figured so many things out, I think there's a lot of optimism. But Polly, I think that that's probably a good place to end our conversation. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fantastic. And I really appreciate that you were willing to go down so many different rabbit holes, even personal ones, but also it was great that we were able to kind of circle back around and connect it to your work. So you mentioned the website a couple of times. It's realdialogue.org. Is that right?
Yes. And my podcast is Waking Up Is Not Enough, Flourishing in the Human Space. And the Substack is Know Thyself. So it's all about being human, getting to know what it means to be human, and loving the human, not the robot, not the dolphin. I mean, we can love them too, but let's just love the human for a while until we figure it out a little better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll post all of those links in the show notes when we post the show, so people can click on them.
It's really been great to get to know you. I mean, I just have to say you're a terrific person, and I've never met you before, and I felt really like I have such a rapport with you. I'm very grateful that you contacted me. Yeah,
I'm really glad too. I thought it went well, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yes, and I will invite you on my podcast too.
Oh, that would be fun. Yeah, I'd appreciate it. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Polly.
Okay.